Her name was Threnala, a Valyrian medic by trade. She had grown up surrounded by tales warning of humanity's dangerous unpredictability. The elders of her people shared dire accounts of human expansion, worlds turned into desolate wastelands, societies torn apart. She believed them all without question. Why wouldn't she? She had never seen a human herself, and her people's past dealings with them were enough to foster a lifetime of distrust. But that was before she crash-landed on a barren moon with no way home. Before Lucas Morgan entered her life. The storm that had taken her vessel by surprise had also destroyed any hopes of rescue. Threnala's escape pod had skidded across jagged terrain, leaving her injured and without contact to the outside world. The moon was lifeless, its gray, craggy surface providing little in the way of resources. Her oxygen generator was failing, and the cold seeped into her bones despite her thermal suit. Lucas, meanwhile, had been on a salvage run. A miner and engineer, he was familiar with the desolate conditions of moons and asteroids, always on the lookout for metals and rare elements. When his scanner picked up the faint distress signal, he hesitated. Helping meant diverting from his route, using up precious fuel, and potentially putting himself at risk. But the idea of leaving someone to die didn't sit right with him. Grumbling to himself, he changed course and followed the signal to its source. Threnala spotted the approaching figure through the small viewport of her pod. The silhouette was unmistakably human, broad shoulders, upright stance. She panicked, her heart pounding in her chest as she grabbed the nearest tool that could serve as a weapon. He knocked on the pod's outer hatch, his movements slow, deliberate. "Hey!" came a muffled voice through his helmet. "Are you okay in there?" Threnala didn't understand the words, but the tone was different from what she expected. He didn't sound aggressive or threatening. Still, she held her makeshift weapon tightly, waiting to see what he would do next. Lucas crouched near the hatch, his face visible through the visor of his helmet. He pointed at himself, then at her pod, miming as if to say, "May I come in?" His gestures were cautious, respectful. Threnala stayed frozen, unsure whether to trust him. She knew humans were cunning, and for all she knew this could be a trap. But as minutes dragged on and he continued to wait, not forcing his way in, her grip on the tool loosened. He was different from the stories, at least so far. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a slow, uncertain nod. The hatch creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside, moving carefully. He removed his helmet, revealing short-cropped hair, a rugged face, and a tentative smile. He glanced around the cramped pod interior before focusing on her. "You're hurt," he said gently, pointing at her bandaged arm. "I can help." Threnala still didn't understand his words, but his expression and gestures made his intentions clear. She allowed him closer, though her body remained tense. Lucas reached into his pack, producing a small medical kit. He held it up for her to see before opening it and showing its contents: gauze, antiseptic, some kind of compact scanner. As he worked, he spoke softly, explaining what he was doing as though she might understand. "This will clean the wound," he said, holding up the antiseptic. "Just a little sting." She watched his every move, her mistrust giving way to cautious curiosity. He was careful, gentle, and efficient. The tales of human brutality seemed distant now, replaced by the immediate reality of his careful hands tending to her injuries. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and studied her for a moment. "You need more than a patched-up arm," he said, though he knew she wouldn't catch the meaning. "This pod isn't going to keep you alive much longer." He pointed at himself again, then mimed walking and pointed outside. Threnala tilted her head, trying to understand. He wanted her to leave the pod? She glanced at the failing oxygen generator and the dwindling supplies. Staying here would mean certain death. The thought made her stomach twist, but the alternative, venturing out into the unknown with a human, was equally terrifying. Lucas stood and extended a hand. His gesture was straightforward, a simple offering of help. She stared at his hand, debating what to do. In the end, necessity won out. If she stayed, she'd die. If she went with him, she might have a chance. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took his hand. Outside, the landscape was every bit as bleak as it had been before. But with Lucas at her side, she felt a sliver of something unfamiliar. Not comfort, exactly, but perhaps the faintest hope that survival was possible. Lucas led her to his small craft, a patchwork of repairs and custom modifications. It wasn't much to look at, but it was better equipped than her broken pod. Once inside, he showed her around, pointing out the oxygen system, the storage compartments, and the small sleeping quarters. He mimed eating, then pointed at the food stores, and she nodded in understanding. The language barrier was significant, but they managed to communicate through gestures, expressions, and trial and error. Lucas showed her how to operate certain systems, and she, in turn, demonstrated her medical knowledge, tending to a burn on his arm he had been ignoring. The small acts of cooperation began to build a fragile trust between them. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the cramped quarters, Lucas pulled out a worn notebook and began sketching. He drew a simple image of his home planet Earth, with its blue oceans and green continents. Then he pointed at Threnala, waiting to see her reaction. Her eyes widened as she understood what he was showing her. She took the pencil from him and, on another page, drew her homeworld, Valeria, with its vast oceans and coral cities. When she finished, she looked up at him, waiting for his response. Lucas studied her drawing, nodding slowly. "Beautiful," he said softly, then pointed at her and mimed the same word. "Beautiful." Threnala didn't know what the word meant, but the tone was unmistakably kind. She smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first time she had smiled at him, and Lucas felt his chest tighten at the sight. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to understand one another, to see past the stereotypes and fear. For the first time, Threnala began to wonder if everything she had been told about humans was wrong. As for Lucas, he found himself wanting to learn more about her world, and about the person behind the guarded exterior. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. A fragile connection forged on a desolate moon. A tentative partnership between two beings who had every reason to distrust each other, yet chose to take a chance on something different. Threnala sat cross-legged on the ship's narrow floor, holding a piece of scrap metal and turning it over in her hands. Lucas had explained, mostly with gestures, how the panel was meant to fit into the air filtration system. He watched her closely, his expression a mix of concentration and encouragement. "You just have to bend it here," Lucas said, tapping a spot with his gloved finger. "Like this." He demonstrated by curving the edge of a similar piece, using a tool that hummed faintly when it activated. Threnala studied his movements, her blue, webbed fingers hesitating as she attempted to mimic his technique. The piece in her hands didn't bend smoothly. Instead, it crumpled slightly, and she frowned, the crest on her head lowering in frustration. Lucas held out his hand. "Let me see," he said, his voice calm. "You were close." She handed him the piece reluctantly, her violet eyes darting away. Lucas tilted it in the dim light, inspecting her work. "Not bad," he said after a moment. "You just need a bit more pressure here." He pressed along the seam with the tool until the metal curved properly. "There, see? You almost had it." Threnala's shoulders relaxed slightly. She nodded and reached for another piece of scrap, ready to try again. This time, Lucas sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. He didn't notice, but she did. A flicker of warmth crept into her cheeks, though she quickly suppressed it. This was about fixing the filtration system, nothing more. "You've got good hands for this," Lucas said, half smiling. "Reminds me of my first few weeks as a mechanic. Couldn't fix a damn thing without breaking it twice." Threnala's head tilted at the unfamiliar words. She caught his tone, light, self-deprecating, and responded with a faint smile. "My people, train carefully. This is new." Lucas blinked, then grinned. "Hey, you're getting better at my language," he said. "Soon you'll be correcting my grammar." Threnala didn't understand grammar, but his smile made her feel less self-conscious. She bent the scrap again, this time applying more pressure where he had shown her. The piece took on the right shape, and she held it up for him to see. "Perfect," Lucas said, giving her a small clap on the shoulder. "We're ready to install it now. Come on." He stood and reached down to help her up. She hesitated a fraction of a second before taking his hand. His grip was firm but not forceful. Once on her feet, she followed him to the back of the ship where the air filtration unit was partially disassembled. "This thing's ancient," Lucas muttered, crouching to open a panel. "Would have replaced it months ago if I could afford it." He waved her closer, motioning toward the unit. "Hold that steady while yeah, right there." Threnala knelt beside him, holding the piece steady as he secured it with small clamps. The two worked in silence for a while, their hands moving in rhythm. Lucas's brow furrowed as he twisted a bolt into place, and Threnala adjusted her grip without him needing to ask. It was unspoken, a kind of coordination that surprised both of them. "There we go," Lucas finally said, exhaling sharply. He reached over to flip a switch and the filtration unit hummed to life. The sound was steady, a low, reassuring whir. Lucas leaned back, grinning. "Nice work, partner." Threnala wasn't sure what partner meant, but she could tell it was positive. She nodded, her eyes softening. "We did well?" "Yeah, we did well," Lucas said, offering a thumbs up. "You learned fast." Threnala watched him closely, her gaze lingering on the way his face brightened when he smiled. She had always thought humans were intimidating, yet Lucas seemed so open. He didn't hide his emotions, didn't try to be anything other than what he was. It was strange. And strangely compelling. Their moment of quiet was interrupted by a sudden, sharp beeping from the cockpit. Lucas's grin faded as he got to his feet. "Something's up," he said, moving toward the ship's controls. Threnala followed, her curiosity piqued. Lucas slid into the pilot's seat, scanning the readouts. "Looks like we've got a comm signal coming through," he muttered. "Could be a ship in the area." Threnala leaned over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar display. "What mean?" "It means we might not be alone out here," Lucas explained, rubbing the back of his neck. "Could be friendlies. Could be not-so-friendlies." Her crest stiffened at that. "Not friendly." "Relax," Lucas said, glancing back at her. "We don't know anything yet. Could just be another miner passing through. Or maybe even your people looking for you." Threnala's brow furrowed. She wasn't sure how she felt about that possibility. If her people were out there, would they assume Lucas had harmed her? Would they treat him as the threat she had once believed all humans to be? The thought made her stomach churn. "We wait?" she asked, her voice careful. "Yeah," Lucas said, settling back into the seat. "We wait and see who answers first." They waited, the minutes stretching into an uncomfortable silence. Threnala watched Lucas as he adjusted the ship's systems, his movements calm but deliberate. His face was set in concentration, yet there was no sign of fear or doubt. The human who was supposed to be dangerous and unpredictable sat quietly, his fingers tapping thoughtfully at the controls. "What?" Threnala began, hesitant. "What will happen, if not friendly?" Lucas met her gaze, his expression softening. "If it's not friendly, we deal with it," he said simply. "Together." The word hung in the air, sinking into her thoughts. Together. Threnala wasn't used to relying on anyone else, let alone a human. But as she looked at Lucas, she felt a flicker of something unexpected. Trust. "Together," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. Lucas smiled. "That's the spirit." He tapped a few more commands into the console and leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We've got time," he said, turning toward her. "Maybe you can show me more about your world, like you did with that drawing. I want to know what it's really like. Not just what they put in the vids." Threnala's lips twitched upward. She thought about the colorful coral cities of her home, the way the sunlight refracted off the ocean waves, and the harmonious songs her people sang during their communal gatherings. It felt far away now, like another life. But the idea of sharing it with Lucas, that didn't seem so strange anymore. "I show you," she said simply, nodding. "We make better." Lucas's smile widened, and for the first time, Threnala felt a warmth that wasn't just from the ship's heaters. It was the warmth of connection, of realizing that, despite everything she had been taught, perhaps humans were capable of more than she ever imagined. The comm signal remained stubbornly silent. Lucas frowned at the console, tapping a few buttons as he tried to boost the receiver's range. Threnala stood beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The quiet hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, and the longer it dragged on, the more it seemed to weigh on her. "Still nothing," Lucas muttered. "Could be interference from that asteroid field we passed. Or maybe it's just an old automated beacon. Either way, I'm not seeing any ships nearby." "Automated beacon?" Threnala asked, tilting her head slightly. Her words still came slowly, as if she were carefully picking each one. Lucas glanced up at her. "Yeah, like a distress call that runs on a loop. Could have been sent out years ago. No one might even be alive on the other end." He caught her puzzled expression and tried again. "It's like a message left behind. Nobody's there anymore, but it keeps repeating, just in case someone hears it." Threnala's eyes narrowed as she processed that, her fingers brushing lightly against her chin. "Message," she said slowly. "A call? For help?" "Exactly," Lucas said, nodding. "But no one's answering. At least, not yet." She frowned, clearly uneasy. Lucas leaned back in his chair, letting out a small sigh. "Hey," he said, trying to shift the mood, "let's not worry about it for now. I've got enough on this rust bucket to keep me busy. You want to help me out with some repairs?" Threnala's gaze flicked to him, her hesitation obvious. But after a moment she nodded. What, need fixing? Plenty, Lucas said with a half-smile. Let's start with the stabilizers. They've been acting up since before I found you. Follow me. He led her to the engineering bay, a cramped space filled with tools, spare parts, and a long console displaying diagnostic readouts. Lucas pointed at a section of piping near the wall. See that? Pressure's been dropping every time we make a hard turn. I need to swap out the coolant flow regulators, but it's a two-person job. Threnala nodded, stepping closer to examine the pipes. What do I do? Lucas handed her a set of tools, his expression turning more serious. You'll need to hold this section steady while I disconnect the old regulator. If it moves too much, we'll have a leak. Just keep it steady, okay? I hold it, Threnala repeated, gripping the pipe carefully. Lucas crouched beside her, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The two worked in close proximity, their movements surprisingly synchronized despite the language barrier. Lucas muttered to himself occasionally, his tone more thoughtful than frustrated. There we go, he said after a few minutes. Now keep holding that while just like that. He reached into the compartment and carefully removed the old regulator, holding it up to inspect. Yep, this thing's shot. No wonder we've been losing pressure. Threnala watched intently, her violet eyes tracking his every movement. Lucas pulled a new regulator from a nearby crate and started installing it, his fingers deftly connecting each line and securing it with clamps. Threnala tightened her grip on the pipe as the unit clicked into place. All right, you can let go now, Lucas said. Good job. Didn't budge an inch. She relaxed her hold, stepping back as he tested the connection. The diagnostic screen lit up, showing a steady green line. Lucas grinned, tapping the console. Looks like we're good. Thanks for the help. You, welcome, Threnala said, her voice quieter than usual. She turned the wrench in her hands, studying it like she was trying to understand its every detail. Lucas wiped his hands on a rag, his smile softening. You're picking this up fast. I don't think I've ever worked this smoothly with anyone before. Threnala glanced up, her crest twitching slightly. Why teach me? Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. Why not? You're smart, you're willing to learn. Plus, if something happens to me, it's good to know you can keep this bucket running. You're part of the crew now. Crew, she repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. Her eyes darted around the bay, taking in the tools and equipment. Then she looked back at Lucas. You trust me? He shrugged, his grin turning lopsided. You've earned it. I mean, you didn't stab me with that tool when we first met, so that's a pretty good start. Threnala tilted her head, her lips quirking in what might have been the faintest hint of a smile. It was fleeting, but Lucas caught it. He gave her a quick thumbs up and turned back to the diagnostics. All right, let's move on to the next thing. We've still got that thruster assembly to check. You good? She nodded, following him to the next section of the ship. Lucas explained the problem as he opened another panel. This one's tricky, he said. Thruster's been overheating because the coolant lines aren't venting properly. I'll need you to monitor the flow levels while I adjust the valves. If it starts climbing too fast, let me know. Threnala took her position by the console, watching as Lucas ducked into the thruster housing. He spoke as he worked, his voice muffled by the tight space. You see that gauge on the left? If it goes into the red, yell at me. Otherwise, just let me know if it's steady. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the display. It stays steady now. Good, Lucas said, twisting a valve. Let me know if that changes. I think this line was clogged. Should be there. That did it. The gauge dipped slightly, then held steady again. Threnala watched it closely, her brow furrowed. Still steady. Lucas slid back out of the housing, wiping grease off his hands. Nice. Looks like that's one less thing to worry about. He looked at her, his expression relaxed. How do you feel about all this? Threnala hesitated, searching for the right words. I learn much. Fixing, no. Yeah, why not? Lucas said, leaning against the console. You're sharp, you work hard, and you don't complain. That's more than I can say for most of the people I've worked with. Threnala looked down, a faint hint of color rising in her cheeks. You very strange human. Lucas laughed, the sound echoing lightly through the bay. I'll take that as a compliment. As the two moved on to the next task, a quiet camaraderie settled between them. They worked side by side, passing tools, exchanging glances, and sharing the occasional word. It wasn't just about fixing the ship anymore. It was about finding a rhythm, a partnership that neither had expected. By now, the two of them had fallen into a pattern. Lucas would point out the next repair, explain what needed doing, and Threnala would help however she could. At first, she'd only fetch tools or held parts in place. But as days went by, she began to take a more active role, tightening bolts, aligning connectors, even suggesting tweaks based on what she observed. Lucas didn't hesitate to encourage her, and before long it felt natural to tackle each task as a team. They were seated side by side on the floor of the cargo bay, sorting through a pile of spare components. Lucas held up a cylindrical part and squinted at it. This might work for the fuel pump intake. What do you think? Threnala took the part from him and inspected it. Her brow furrowed as she ran a finger along one edge. It's too small here, she said carefully. Will not fit well. Lucas smirked. Good eye. All right, that's out. Let's see what else we've got. He tossed the part onto a growing discard pile and reached for another. As they continued, the conversation grew more relaxed. Lucas talked about his life back home, stories about fixing beat-up vehicles on Earth's dusty frontier colonies, the odd jobs he'd taken before he ended up here. Threnala listened intently, her violet eyes flicking between the parts in her hands and his face as he spoke. You always fix things? She asked at one point, her words halting but clear. Lucas chuckled. Seems like it. I guess I'm one of those people who likes making something broken work again. He held up a tarnished connector and shook his head. Though some things just aren't worth the effort. Threnala considered this, then asked, why keep fixing here? She gestured to the ship around them. Why not go back? Lucas set down the connector, his expression shifting. Going back's not so simple, he said. I've got debts. People I owe. You can't just walk away from that. She tilted her head. Debts? Yeah. When you borrow money to start something or to keep going, you have to pay it back. And if you don't, he trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, it's not good. Threnala frowned slightly. On my world, we share needs. No debts. Lucas smiled faintly. Sounds nice. Earth's not like that. You gotta fend for yourself most of the time. They fell into a thoughtful silence. The clinking of metal parts the only sound. After a while, Threnala said, You are alone here. Lucas looked up, surprised. Not anymore, he said quietly. I've got you. Her crest flicked slightly, a gesture he'd learned to interpret as thoughtful or perhaps uncertain. She didn't respond, but her hands moved with more focus, sorting parts with a steady rhythm. Lucas decided not to press her. He simply handed her the next piece and returned to his work. Later, they were back in the engine room, installing a refurbished coolant valve. The tight space forced them to work shoulder to shoulder. Lucas grunted as he maneuvered the valve into position. Can you hold that clamp for me? He asked. Threnala reached over and held the clamp steady. Like this. Perfect, Lucas said, giving her a nod. Now I just need to. The valve slipped from his grasp, and coolant sprayed out in a brief, pressurized burst. Lucas let out a sharp exclamation and scrambled to tighten the line. Threnala quickly grabbed a nearby towel and pressed it against the spray, helping to contain the leak. Hold on, Lucas said, wrestling the valve back into place. He tightened the connection and finally sealed it. The hiss of escaping coolant faded, leaving only their heavy breathing. Lucas sat back, wiping a hand across his forehead. Well, that could have gone better. You made a mistake? Threnala asked, tilting her head. Lucas laughed softly. Sure did. Happens to the best of us. Thanks for the quick save. Threnala looked down at the towel, now soaked in coolant, and then back at Lucas. You are not afraid to make mistakes? Lucas shrugged. You gotta be willing to mess up if you want to learn. Otherwise, you're not gonna get very far. He smiled at her. Besides, it's easier when you've got someone there to help pick up the slack. Her gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. You teach me. I help you. That's the deal, Lucas said with a grin. All right, let's get this place cleaned up. Together, they scrubbed the engine bay, wiping down surfaces and ensuring the coolant was safely contained. Threnala handed Lucas a clean rag, and their fingers brushed for a moment. Lucas noticed her pause, but she said nothing. He took the rag and continued working, pretending not to have noticed. As the day wound down, they found themselves in the common area, sharing a meal of rehydrated rations. Lucas chewed thoughtfully, watching Threnala as she examined the strange, vacuum-sealed food. Not like your stuff back home, huh? He asked. She shook her head. Food from sea. Always fresh. Lucas chuckled. Well, you'll have to forgive Earth food. It's not exactly gourmet, but it keeps you going. Threnala took a careful bite, her face remaining neutral. Lucas smirked. Not bad, right? She hesitated, then nodded slightly. Edible. High praise, Lucas said, laughing. Threnala studied him as he ate, the lines of his face, the way he leaned back casually, his free hand tapping the table's surface in an absent rhythm. Not what I thought. Lucas looked at her, raising an eyebrow. What did you think I'd be like? Dangerous, she said simply. All stories said humans are danger. Lucas set his fork down, his gaze softening. And now? She held his gaze for a moment before speaking. Not danger. Just human. A slow smile spread across his face. I'll take that. They sat in companionable silence, the tension from earlier fading away. As Lucas finished his meal, he leaned back and stretched. You've been a big help, he said. I don't think I could have gotten all this done without you. Threnala's crest moved slightly, the alien equivalent of a shrug. I learn much. You good teacher. Lucas grinned. Guess we make a good team. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them closing in ways neither could fully articulate. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned their attention back to the work at hand. There was always something to fix, always another system to check. But the days were no longer just about survival. They were building something together, something that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The soft hum of the ship's engines filled the air as Threnala and Lucas leaned over a cluttered workbench. A tangled mess of wires and circuits lay between them, the remains of a faulty comms relay. Threnala poked at a burned-out capacitor with the tip of a small tool, her crest flicking in what Lucas had come to recognize as frustration. This, broken, she said, tilting the capacitor for him to see. Her voice had grown steadier in his language over the past few days, though her words were still simple and deliberate. Yeah, looks fried, Lucas replied, plucking the capacitor from her fingers. We'll need to scavenge a replacement. He rummaged through a nearby container, muttering under his breath. I know I've got a spare here somewhere. Threnala watched him dig through the bin, her sharp eyes catching the glint of something metallic. She reached over and pulled out a small, dusty component. This? Lucas glanced at it, his face lighting up. Hey, good find. That should work. He set it on the bench and nodded at the relay. Okay, let's swap it in. Threnala held the relay steady as Lucas began soldering the new capacitor into place. The soldering iron hissed softly and the faint scent of melting metal filled the air. They worked in unspoken harmony, Threnala adjusting her grip as Lucas turned the relay to get a better angle. He paused once, glancing up at her with a faint smile. See? I told you you're good at this, he said, carefully applying the final bit of solder. She tilted her head, her crest shifting. You sure I help? Lucas laughed softly, setting down the soldering iron. I'm positive. I couldn't have done half of this without you. Threnala looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. He grinned, patting her on the shoulder. Good. They moved on to testing the relay. Lucas connected it to the diagnostic panel and watched the readouts as Threnala monitored the output. The screen flickered, then displayed a steady green line. Lucas gave a low whistle. That's what I like to see. Threnala glanced at the screen, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. It works now. Yeah, Lucas said, his grin widening. It works. Her gaze shifted from the screen to him, her expression thoughtful. You are not like other humans. Lucas raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She hesitated, her crest lowering. Stories say humans destroy, take, but you fix, help. Lucas leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. Guess the stories don't tell the whole truth, huh? Threnala tilted her head again, her lips twitching in a small, fleeting smile. No, not whole truth. For a while, they just stood there, the hum of the ship filling the silence. Lucas finally pushed away from the bench, stretching. All right, let's keep moving. I want to check the primary thruster alignment before we call it a day. Threnala nodded, following him down the narrow corridor. The ship's interior had become more familiar to her now, the tight passages and clanking metal no longer unsettling. She still missed the open seas of her home world. But here, with Lucas, she had found something she didn't expect. A sense of purpose. In the engine room, Lucas handed her a diagnostic tool and directed her to one of the consoles. Okay, I need you to read me the numbers as I make adjustments, he said, moving toward a control panel near the thruster housing. Call them out one by one. Got it. Threnala studied the console, her fingers hovering over the controls. I read numbers. Call out. Exactly, Lucas said, giving her a thumbs up. All right, here goes. Start with the first one. She squinted at the screen and carefully read out 0.23. Lucas adjusted a dial, then nodded. Okay, next. 0.24, she said, her voice steady. Got it. One more. 0.25. Lucas stepped back from the panel and gave her a grin. Perfect. That's exactly what I needed. Threnala straightened, her crest lifting slightly. I help again. You're pretty good at it, Lucas said, his tone light. I might have to hire you full-time. She tilted her head, clearly unsure what he meant. But his smile made her own lips curve just a little. You, strange human. Lucas laughed. Yeah, I've heard that one before. As they wrapped up, the ship's systems hummed smoothly around them. Lucas glanced at Threnala and said, You know, I think we make a pretty good team. Team, she repeated, testing the word. Yes, we are team. He nodded, reaching out and giving her shoulder a light squeeze. A damn good one. The two of them headed back to the common area, their steps in sync. The ship might still have its quirks, its systems in constant need of attention, but for now it felt stable. More than that, it felt like a place they could make their own. Together.